Now that we've talked about some of the problems with the grid, I want to talk about some of the solutions to managing the problems. We're going to divide the solutions into two parts, and in this video, we're going to consider what I would call relatively low-tech solutions for managing the grid. The first of these solutions are called demand response events. And this is essentially a fancy term for when grid operators ask electricity consumers to stop using as much electricity on a voluntary basis. An example of this happened last year in California on September 6, 2022. At around 6 p.m., Californians were warned that the electricity grid had too much demand and there was a risk that there would be rolling blackouts. So people would lose their power for a couple of hours at a time. So what ended up happening is that the grid operators basically sent emergency text to everybody's smartphones in the state, and it basically asked them to conserve energy. And they said this was for public health. Now this is important because when people lose electricity, it can be a serious health problem. Some people might need equipment to live. This is especially true in a lot of hospitals where emergency operations and equipment need to operate. But of course, we also have to think about if you completely lose your power, you're going to lose things like your air conditioning. And Californians needed it at this point because they were dealing with a record-breaking heat. So this was being caused by a heat wave that had hit the state. And basically everyone had their air conditioning on, trying to cool themselves down. So when a grid operator makes this kind of ask, they're engaged in a demand response event. So there's an event, in this case a heat wave, and they basically ask people to respond by reducing their demand. And what ended up happening is that Californians ended up conserving enough energy to keep the electricity system operating effectively. So over the next half hour, people in California used about 2,000 megawatts less of electricity. To put this in perspective, this is about the size of 4 nuclear reactors in Ontario. So that was enough basically to make sure that the demand, which was previously too high, was brought into line with the amount of supply. And what ended up happening is that nobody lost their power. It is true that people might have had less lights, they may not have used their laptop, they may have had to turn their air conditioning up a few degrees so they weren't as cool, but nobody completely lost power. So what demand response events do is they basically ask everyone to sacrifice a little to basically keep the entire system running, maybe not as good as you might want it, but still running pretty effectively for most people. Another relatively low-tech way that we can do load balancing with the electrical grid is with something called time shifting. Time shifting relies on something called time of use pricing. And what this means is that depending on the time of day that you use electricity, you get different costs. So electricity, when there's high demand, tends to be more expensive. And the idea is that hopefully it will discourage people from using it during those times. When there's very low demand, then electricity is cheap. And they're trying to encourage people to use more electricity during those times. Time of use pricing in Ontario depends on what time of day and what time of year and what day of the week you're using electricity. So you notice that at all times of the year, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., basically the night and overnight, electricity is very cheap. So this green area represents off-peak, and that basically means that electricity demand overall is relatively low. So when you use electricity during these times, you pay less money for it. Basically, Ontario produces generally too much electricity overnight. We have our nuclear power plants and our hydroelectricity plants running, and often wind is very productive at night as well. So the idea is that if we could get people to use more electricity at night, then we're going to have more available potentially during the day. We're going to reduce demand for electricity during the day. Now, during the weekends, because electricity demand is lower overall, a lot of businesses aren't operating, people are at home, and the like, electricity demand tends to be lower. So another thing that this could encourage people to do is if there's things that they don't need to do until the weekend, that they could essentially wait until that time. So we tend to overproduce electricity during the weekend. If we can get more people using it then we'll have to curtail less. Now you'll also notice that in the summer and winter months, we have these yellow and red areas. This is when demand for electricity is higher. And in the summer, the red area, which are called on-peak, is when the electricity is most expensive. And the reason why it's most expensive is because more people are using air conditioning during this time to deal with the heat. So we charge people more for electricity during this time in the summer, and slightly less basically in the morning and the evening when people are leaving for work and coming home. Now, when you look at what's happening in the winter, you'll notice that those time periods are reversed. So we charge the most from 7 to 11 a.m. in the morning and 5 to 7 p.m. in the evening. And that's because during the winter months, that tends to be when people are turning on their heat the most. They're going to also be cooking more hot meals. So there's more demand when people are waking up and first arriving home in the winter. During the day, many of us turn down our thermostats and we're not heating as much. So we're using less power in the winter during the middle part of the day. So the idea is that we use time shifting to try to encourage people to make their activities during the off-peak or green sections when we tend to over-generate electricity. And we're trying to discourage people from using it during the yellow and red areas where we tend to have less supply. So if we shift it around, we can make the grid more stable. And rather than having this kind of difficult balancing act, we can tend to keep the balance more equal during most parts of the day. So one of the things that we could potentially use load shifting for is for charging electric cars. Electric cars use a lot of electricity to charge their battery, and depending on the time of the day, you can save a lot of money. So for example, if you were to charge your car during the summer overnight, it would take you about $3 worth of electricity to fully charge a Nissan Leaf. So it has a 40 kilowatt hour battery and takes about 8 hours to charge. So this would be much less expensive than charging it in the middle of the day when electricity prices are on peak or during the mid-peak, those periods of high demand. And one of the things about this is that generally speaking, people are not going to care if when their car charges as long as it normally has a high charge. So if you're charging your car overnight, it's going to be ready to go in the morning. And generally speaking, people have a lot of options for shifting activities like this so that they're using electricity during those periods when it's cheapest and also when the grid has too much of that electricity. So charging it overnight would also help reduce the amount of curtailment. And if we're generating a lot of electricity from clean and green sources like wind, this basically means that your car would be using and generating a lot fewer emissions than if there's natural gas being used in the grid, which tends to happen more often during the day when people might be running their air conditioning. So basically the idea is change the time that we use electricity. The grid can basically deal with problems of curtailment or too much demand. In a lot of grid systems, gas peaker plants are used to deal with unanticipated demand. So if we have a hot day, for example, and everyone's turning on their air conditioners, we tend to turn on these natural gas peaker plants so that we have enough electricity. A big problem with that, however, is that natural gas, when we burn it, is creating a lot of emissions. Natural gas peaker plants are also very expensive to run, generally, and that's why we only use them as a backup option. Another thing that we might do is that we might try to import electricity from other grids but that electricity tends to be more expensive than the electricity that we generate ourselves. So if Ontario has a lot of demand for electricity, we can try to buy it from Quebec or New York or Michigan, neighboring provinces and states, but those grid systems tend to charge us more money for importing that electricity. So if we're looking for cost-effective methods and we're looking to reduce emissions, basically we want to try to avoid importing electricity or turning on natural gas plants as much as possible. And as I pointed out, if the demand is too low and we're producing too much, we essentially have to waste or curtail that much energy. So the reason why Ontario currently prices electricity to be cheaper at night and overnights and during the weekend is that those are the times that we're tending to produce more or too much electricity. So the prices are intended to encourage people to use electricity at different times of the day and at different times of the week. Other grid systems could also use similar kinds of pricing to solve their problems as well. So in California, that produces a lot of solar electricity, they might decide to make electricity during the day when solar power is very productive. They might decide to make that electricity much more cheap. So maybe it would encourage people to charge their electric cars in the middle of the day when it's sunniest, when the batteries would be getting electricity from clean solar power instead. So the idea behind this is that we essentially use differentials in pricing to encourage people to use electricity during different parts of the day. And by doing this, we can make the grid system much more consistent to keep supply and demand basically similar to each other over the entire day and over the entire week.